Hello? Okay, you can hear me, good. I hate these stands. Good evening, everybody. Very nice to see everybody here today. This program is in honor of Women's History Month. March is always Women's History Month. You can applaud if you want to. It took a long time. There are 2 panels. Oh, ours is the first, and the way Gretchen titled it, it was therapists. The 5 of us all have worked in the helping professions, and we have different degrees, which we'll talk about as we go on. But we're the first panel, and next week there will be a second panel that is about the medical profession, and people who have been nurses and doctors and I don't know, whatever, in helping, direct helping professions of health will be talking then. So I am going to start this off by talking a little bit about the history of women in work. Up until the 20th century, women for the most part did not work outside the home. They worked in the home. They were not really, once they got married, they definitely were not permitted to work outside of the home because it was considered an insult to the husband, because that meant that he could not afford to give his wife a life that she might have been used to. But because of wars, when women needed to to come to work and take jobs that men had, the more women became occupied in those professions. There were very few occupations that were open to women, even women that went on to higher education. This group of women all have gone on to higher education. Everybody on the panel has at least one master's degree, if not more. So we're a very select group of women. We're not a women of typical of the age that we grew up in, which was about 50 years ago, I would say, that we were working. And each individual person will talk a little bit later about their own experience in the workplace. The idea of women working and supporting themselves is a very new idea in terms of historical, and in terms of the history of the world, and in terms of the history of work. But there are many more women in the workplace today than ever before, but women still do not have parity in terms of salary with men, and they will not have parity, which means making the same as a man, until 2050 is what it's projected. I can't tell you exactly what it is at this moment, but it's starting in 1963. It was 59 cents an hour to $1, and then it went to 77 cents, and now it's going to take another 20 years to get to 100%. When we all went to school, there were many, many occupations that were not open to us, and the occupations that were open to us were nursing, teaching, secretarial work, and of course there was always domestic work that women always did historically, and but you didn't need an education for that. Librarians, but that for the most part was what you had in front of you when you went to school, and many women became teachers, and because that, as my father said to me, you'll get married and you'll have children and you'll have the summers off and you'll be able to take care of them, and you won't, well, I didn't like being a teacher, so I changed my profession, which you'll hear what now. But that's the choices that women had. However, things have grown as we have gone on in time from the 1950s. There have been changes, very positive changes for women in terms of fields that are open to them. And I'm going to turn this over to Bonnie Kay, who's going to tell you a little bit about her daughter's generation and what was available to her.
And what about my generation in terms of the work that I did?
You'll talk about yourself later.
Oh, I didn't really, I apologize. What?
Go ahead, Bonnie, it's all yours.
Okay, I started working in 1957 when the minimum wage was $1 an hour. And I did the kind of jobs that were open at that time. I'm going to talk about my daughter's generation because she was born in 1970, and so you know what happened in 1974.
Talking into the
Oh.
light.
In 1974, they integrated the Ivy League schools so that women could be accepted there. And my daughter was able to benefit from that situation. Now, you know about how the colleges work. Everything is on a quota system. This many girls, this many football players, this many alumni, and so forth. If you live in an affluent suburb of New York, you have a very hard time getting a seat in one of the elite universities. If you live in Wyoming or overseas, you are a target for them and have a much easier point getting in. And so, okay, so my daughter got her bachelor's degree and then wanted to get an MBA. And when she was going to get her MBA, they said to her, you come here and you pay the $150,000 for your tuition and you will be priceless. They will all want you. So she enrolls at Wharton in their MBA program, and she went out on her, you know, when you go get your job, like an internship, and the man said to her, we hate you MBAs because you come here thinking that you want, you know, you're worth more than the average person who has 5 or 10 years experience. You want to be paid for that experience, and they were not thrilled with it at the different companies that she went to. But moreover, she got married, and they told her there she could have it all. She could raise her children. All she needed was a live-in nanny, and she could have her career also. And she believed it. And then after a couple of years, she said to me, Ma, you can't have it all. I can't be on a business trip to California and be there for my kid's concert. Or I leave on a business trip and the kid is sick. And she found that the nanny was experiencing things that she wanted to experience in her life. And so that's what I mean when I say you can't have it all. As a woman, I mean, and some women are career women, and they can have the nanny do all that mothering and it doesn't bother them. But for women that really want to experience their 15 or so years as a parent, it's a difficult choice. So that's all I wanted to say about that.
Thank you, Bonnie. Now we're going to hear from, why don't I just block your name? What's her name? Yeah, Sue. We hear from Ronnie Sue. And she's going to talk about more current situations, girls in college and coming out of college today.
I think I should say, first of all, that we're talking about working class and middle class women. I mean, as you know, there's plenty of women in this country who have to work because they are poor or they're single parents or whatever. We're not talking about them. We're talking about the demographic here in this room. So women today, I wrote out a lot of notes because I forget, so you'll bear with me because I have my notes. Women have achieved a lot more today. 59.5% of university students are female, and 65% of people who graduate from university are female. 53.7% of medical school students are female. This is amazing. In Great Britain, it's 55%. However, men continue to get the higher salaries. I looked at, we have people on our panel here who have degrees in psychology, but because there's so many different kinds of degrees in psychology and occupational therapy, I just looked at psychologists and MSWs. Today, because we're talking about women in the helping professions, today of MSWs, 72.2% are women. For psychologists, 57.9% are women. So we're still in the majority in the helping professions. However, men in our professions get promoted before women, so they're promoted right up into the managerial levels before women are. And of course, in terms of the racial makeup, 66.9% of MSWs are white and 79% of psychologists are white. So have we really come that far along? Well, yes and no. I Googled where women today in the helping professions, what professions are they going into today and what are their median salaries? Anybody have an idea of what the number one is?
Nursing,
No.
teaching.
Preschool and kindergarten teachers are the number one helping profession that women are going into. And it's interesting, nursing, there are more men going to nursing today, but I'll leave that for the panel next week. Then came dental hygienists, followed by speech and language pathologists, dental assistants, childcare workers, secretaries, administrative assistants, medical records technicians, dietitians, cosmetologists, and medical assistants. These are the top 10 professions that working and middle class women are going into today. What are the men going into? Number one, surprisingly, secondary school education. That really surprised me. But after that, you have environmental scientists, forensic science technicians, video operators, physical therapy assistants, film editors, surgical technologists, sound engineering technologists, public relations, and web developers. I couldn't get their annual salaries, but I'm sure you and I know that their salaries are going to be much higher than childcare workers. Women today are also dealing with financial insecurities that our generation of middle-class women didn't have to deal with, particularly during the two recessions we've had and the recent pandemic. More women left the workforce during the pandemic than men, obviously, because their children were home, the schools were closed, and they couldn't do both. There've also been there's something called, which I had never heard of before, trauma-centered feminism. What is trauma-centered feminism? It's attacks against women from the right. For example, removing the right to abortion, misogyny at the workplace, sexual harassment at work, campus rapes, attacks on LGBTQ members. On the bright side, I'll leave you with this. There are young women today who are making inroads in what have before had been mostly male-dominated fields. Bus drivers. Our granddaughter is going to school to be an airline mechanic. Firefighters, sanitation workers. The other day, we live in a cottage and the garbage truck came by and yeah, it was a woman. And I went out and I said, thank you, and she went like this. So pilots, women pilots, so that leaves you with a little bit of a bright side.
What I wanted to say was the occupations that Ronnie spoke about are not high-paying occupations. Not all of them. As a matter of fact, some of them are really low-paying. But I read statistics that said more than 50% of women college graduates end up being secretaries. That secretarial skills are basically needed. Now, they may not be doing filing the way women were doing before because of computers, but that kind of clerical assistance, they're not being the CEOs. And women in all of the fields that we talked about, the administrators, are men, for the most part, not women. Now, Michelle is a rarity in the fact that she was an accountant, which was not a female-occupied profession, and then she became a CEO of an organization. Most of the time, a man would be brought in to head the organization because women aren't trusted. And to a large extent, they're not, and they still, especially if you're married or you might get married, you might have a child, those prejudices are still very much operative when women go for jobs, unless they're very highly skilled or very, very highly educated. Like if you have a PhD in something, there may not be that many people that have a PhD in the same field you do. You as a woman may, in fact, be able to get a job. But if you are a teacher, and I've seen this happen in my grandchildren's school, you may never get tenure. It's very hard nowadays to get tenure. A lot of times, women are, after a couple of years, they're closed out of it, and they have to go to another school system. So the school systems, that protection is not a great availability to women. And when Ronnie was talking about security, well, if you don't have the security of having tenure, and you don't have the security of a husband, and you don't have the security of a pension, it's hard. It's hard to look at how you're going to be able to save enough money for your retirement, as everybody in this room has some kind of a something obviously that brought them here that allowed them to pay for Woodland Pond and to keep up your monthly charges for Woodland Pond. But I think that we are part of a generation that will not continue, and I don't know whether our children will be able to meet that standard. However, we have some very interesting stories, and we're going to move on with them, and I'm going to start with you. Yes, why don't you introduce yourself?
I think people know who I am. I'm Tamar Oppler. When we got together, to plan this evening, one of the points that was made was that we should speak about our degrees. So I'll tell you very quickly my degrees. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy with a minor in comparative literature. I have a master's degree in English literature, and I have an MSW later when I went to, while I was studying for my MSW, I started psychoanalytic training. And I think I'm the only one here who does kind of depth analysis, psychoanalysis, the long-term treatments. So maybe I should sort of focus on that. Psychoanalysis is traditionally taught in what we call psychoanalytic institutes, not in universities. And there is no university degree for a psychoanalyst. In America, traditionally, it was restricted to MDs. Then it opened up to psychologists. And Freud had pushed for what he called lay analysts, which is someone who has whatever university degrees and then studies at an institute and is not medically trained. And he felt that medical training is sometimes a hindrance in working with the person. So that's how I came into psychoanalysis. My training was 8 years. There was nothing else in the world. It was all psychoanalytic training. You had to see a number of patients for 300 or 400 hours and be supervised on them, and have hundreds more hours. And we went to class. I was trying to reconstruct this. Class went from 7 to 8:45 with a 15-minute break, or if you went straight through, it was 7 to 8:30. And then it went from 9 p.m. to 10:45, and if you didn't take a break, it was 10:30. So we all got home at 11:30 at night, and you did this for years, and you loved it. That's what you were doing. That's who you are. And I think that's part of the problem of why I'm still working. I can't stop working. I am an analyst. Now, today, we work very, very differently than we did in the 70s and 80s, and analysts are more related to their patients, they're more open about themselves, but we're really trained to work with, quote, the whole person. And when people say, do you specialize? No, I'm not an expert in trauma. I'm not an expert in abuse. I'm not an expert in eating disorders. But my training enables me to work with all of these as part of the person. I want to touch on something that Rhea mentioned. And when we met to discuss this program, I was the only one in this situation. Salary. As a private practitioner, I always set my own fee. A patient comes in or calls, what's your fee? And it was never easy, but as you go through training and you hear what the men are asking, and you know what you're asking, and you know what your girlfriends in the field are asking, it becomes very, very difficult because you have to put out that number. And men are psychoanalysts, women are in the helping professions. So it gives it a very different sort of mental set. And I worked very hard to be equal to the men. Not, how can I put it? I worked very hard to try to recognize that I'm worth it, if they're worth it. And we were in classes together. I knew their treatments, they knew my treatments, but it was a very hard road to set your own fee. And you know, you speak about husbands and pensions and tenure. All of us as private practitioners had only the option of a KEO plan. Now, a KEO plan, an IRA, can be terrific when the market's going up. It's not so terrific when the market's going down. So your future, your retirement, and it's in your own hands. You have to plan for your own retirement. Nobody's giving you a pension. Nobody's giving you tenure. So these are part of, we never talk about these things, but they're part of the profession. They're ingrained in it. How am I doing? Huh? I should wind it up. What I want to say, psychoanalysis and psychotherapy traditionally have been long-term treatments. And in today's world, with everything people are going through and the shortage of mental health services, I mean, everybody is trying to adapt their practices to squeeze in as much as they can, and I think everyone in the field is so cognizant of the stresses that are added to anybody's situation, and that really complicates what we're doing. And the theme of self-care comes in, mainly in the form of you're working too many hours. So we deal with that too. Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Okay.
You wanna go next? Yes, you.
Hello, okay. Okay, I am an occupational therapist, and OT is a very old profession, and it was mainly a women profession until the late 80s, and in the 90s, when you have the ADA, that is the American Disability Act, sudden our salaries went up. They recognized us as not the people that made the craft and the
Hold it like a lollipop.
okay. And not the people that help with craft, but a real helping profession. What happened then that men came into the profession because our salary went up. Why? Because we were in demand. And it was a very good thing that men came in. 15 years ago we had the same salary. Today I don't know how the market goes for salaries or the occupation for me. When I started working, I worked in a mental health facility. It was a daycare, and I mostly in Lucida. Lucida is what my patients call the Lower East Side of Manhattan. It was predominantly Puerto Rican, some maybe some. We have only one patient, but predominantly all Puerto Rican women. There were some men, but after a year and a half, the ladies were great. They teach me how to cook. They were playing all the time. They were playing billiard. I didn't know how to do it. They teach me, but it was not what I felt. That was I couldn't know what. I couldn't see what was the problem with them. For me, they were normal. I couldn't see the pathology. And then I moved. And I moved and I went to work in a very big city hospital, rehabilitation. And this is where I learned really to be an OT. It was the 90s, I think, no, it was before that, I think before the 90s. And it was the time where New York City have a big gang problems. And my patients, many of them were young men, but I mean young, 18, 17, 20, with spinal cord injuries from the 6 Okay, I don't want to go in details. There were, more of them were or paraplegic or with injuries that took the leg down. All of them were in wheelchair. And I learned a lot from my patients. Endurance, patience, sexuality. Because you can't believe that, I couldn't believe, let's say, I was a woman married with the same man for 40 years, and I couldn't understand how an 18 years old boy, but for me was a boy, paralyzed from the chest down, has sex in his mind all the time. Was his one preoccupation. He was more preoccupied about his erection than his walking. And I learned a lot about them. And it was a great experience, and it was a learning experience. And I really was very sad to leave it, but my daughter was having a baby, and she was living 6 hours away from our house, and I wanted to be there for my first grandchild. And in rehabilitation, you cannot work 3 days a week. You need to be there 5 days a week. I started working part-time. I work in a clinic, in an AIDS clinic, where AIDS was in the high, in Harlem it was. And okay, I have a lot of patients, but for me, again, it was not my patient were great, it was me. I couldn't take the idea that so many of them were dying, and were dying not for AIDS, they were dying from overdose. And okay, how could you cut her what I mean that with his life, especially in those times that was so difficult, the pandemic. After this, okay, I decided to take it easy, and I started working for the school system. And for the last 15 years, I worked with autistic children. 15 years of my working work, not the last 15 years, and retired more than this. I work with autistic children, with all the game. It's a very big spectrum. And they were great. It was, again, a wonderful experience. I learned a lot from the teachers, from my co-workers. Let's say, in special education, they did OTs, PTs, speech therapies, and counselors, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But sure, PT, OT, and until they are 21. Okay, and this is what I did.
The microphone.
Microphone.
The microphone.
And now we're going to hear from the person whose name I forgot.
Ronnie Sue.
It's still running. Again, I'm going to read, so excuse me. I decided at a very early age that I wanted to be a social worker. Even though when I was growing up, the prevailing wisdom in my community was be a teacher, a nurse, or a nun. Well, since I wasn't Catholic, that last option wasn't open to me. I had tremendous family support who encouraged my independence and to be what I ever wanted to be, except if you become a teacher, you could have school vacations home with your children.
My father was right.
If you're a PT, OT in school too.
After college, I was accepted to Chicago School of Social Service Administration with a full stipend. This was in 1966, but I didn't go to school then. I got waylaid for a few years. It was 1966, you all remember what was going on in the country then, and I joined a summer Vista program in Appalachia, and I decided at the tender age of 20 that I was too young to go to social work school, and that working in the war on poverty in Appalachia was much more interesting and more important to do in the 60s. I had no regrets, but it took me 11 years to finally go to social work school. By then, funding was scarcer, but I worked and I had a little help from my family and a little help from National Defense Student Loan, and I was able to realize my professional goals. I had a very different experience as an MSW than Tamar. One of the great things about Masters of Social Work was that you can do a lot of things with a Masters of Social Work. Most of my professional life was as a director of employee assistance programs, which are counseling programs at a workplace where employees get access to help where they work. I was the director of the programs at Mount Sinai and St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospitals in New York. And my last job before I retired, I was the director of the EAP at the New York City Transit Authority. And you're gonna ask, what does a counselor, a social worker do with the Transit Authority? Well, the beauty of such programs is that the leverage of job security helps people get the treatment they need. At the hospitals, some of our employees who became our clients were nurses or other workers who had psychological or addiction problems and had easy access to drugs on the job. At the Transit Authority, most of our clients were employees in what they call safety-sensitive jobs. These are people whose lives of the riding public are dependent on their ability to maintain, fix, or drive a vehicle, a bus, or a subway. So under federal law, they are tested for drugs or alcohol, and if they come up positive, if they want to keep their job, they have to go into treatment, and our unit ran the treatment. The job was a fantastic incentive for help, as most of our employees only had a high school education and were making terrific salaries and had great benefits. Our employee assistance program was mandated under federal law to clear them to go back to work. This was not something we took lightly. If a train operator was addicted to cocaine and went through the treatment we had recommended, we were the ones who had to sign on the dotted line that they were sufficiently rehabilitated and could go back to work driving a train and not endanger the riding public. Our clients were overwhelmingly male, mostly African American or Latino, and the few women who were our clients often told of the different additional stresses on the job. They had to care for children at home, and when they came to work and put their clothes in the locker, they had to look at lurid pictures of naked women. Stress is not good for anyone, especially people who are trying to kick drugs and alcohol. So here I was, a white woman with an MSW, running a shop of African American and Latino men. There were 12 of us. I was the only woman at the beginning and the only white woman. And we had two PhD psychologists who I supervised. And in deference to the psychologists here, and out in the room, they did not want to be supervised by an MSW, let alone a female MSW. And boy, did they give me a hard time. And then after I retired, a male was hired as the director, and I ran into one of my old colleagues and I said, well, how is so-and-so doing? And he said, boy, he comes into work and he says, oh boy, I wish Ronnie was still here. Boy, vindication. The job paid very well for a female MSW in the 90s and 2000s, and a great retirement benefits, which helped us to move to Woodland Pond. Sometimes we had to turn away employees. For example, when I was working at the hospital, a man called and asked if we could help him get a mortgage. And my assistant told him that our department didn't offer that kind of help. But it turned out well because I met him and we got married.
What a wonderful story. Bonnie is our psychologist, and she's going to talk about how she got to be one. It's a long and treacherous road. As I started to say at the beginning before, I started working in 1957 because of family issues. I was 14 the day I got my working papers and started working in the jobs that were available to a 14-year-old. And I have to say, I think some of which makes me valuable as a psychologist as having worn so many different shoes and having been in contact with so many different types of people in the jobs I held. I worked in a bakery, I worked in Bamberger's, I worked in a law firm, I worked all that, and that was when I was still in high school. Then my parents felt that I shouldn't go to college because they needed me to be able to support myself when I graduated high school because they could no longer support me. So I took a secretarial course while everybody else of my friends all were in college prep. So I had secretarial English, I had Greg Steno, and I'm a lefty. So imagine taking steno as a lefty, getting your hands stuck on those wires coming on. I was the worst student in the class. All these like neat little secretary type girls that couldn't do any of it, you know? And then we had different English. I had secretarial English. I could write a business letter like you wouldn't believe. And they're studying Shakespeare. Somehow during one of these weird things, the guidance counselor called my mother and said something about I should go to college. So I started taking courses so that I could get in. My grades were horrible because I was taking care of my younger brother and sister and my mother who was ill. And every time I sat down and did my homework, I felt guilty because of all the work that had to be done in that house and the kids that had to be taken care of. How dare I be so selfish? And so I was able to see the challenge of poor kids and why they weren't excelling in school. In any event, the guidance counselor knew the director of admissions, and they called me in, and he said to look at his IQ, and the guy at Rutgers said to me, "Don't you dare flunk out," you know? And he said to me, "I'm gonna take you, don't you dare flunk out." And I didn't, and I got through the first 6 months, and I said, nobody can ever take that away from me. That's something I have. Okay, so I go to Rutgers and I major in history, and of course there's no jobs coming out for female history teachers because those are the jobs for the coaches. So I couldn't get a job, and then I decided to go up and work in the mountains as a waitress. And I learned a lot there about how hard it is to be 50 years old and to be lugging trays and working on your feet like that. And I said, I don't want to do that. So I ended up going back and getting an elementary education certification. I got a job there. And I loved the kids. It was wonderful. But teaching was not for me. It wasn't have the stimulation that I needed. So I got married and decided I was going to stay home and watch soap operas. That's what I was looking forward to. Well, that didn't last long. But I will tell you this, that in the 10 years that I didn't work, I'd look at women with jobs and I'd say, oh my God, she's working. I mean, my self-esteem went down like you wouldn't believe. And as a matter of fact, we were up here looking for a house, and my husband's in the front with the real estate agent, and we see a dog, and I said, bow wow. And the two of them look at me like I was crazy. I was with kids for so long, my own ones that were raising. I didn't have adult conversation. I mean, it was really something. So we lived through that, and then I wanted to go back to work because my kids were older. Well, my good friend, who some of you may know, Mary Ann Fallick, was very good friends with, what's his name, Maurice Hinchy. And so through political connections, she got me a job at the Department of Labor doing summer employment. And I was able to get a job at the college doing student employment from that summer internship. And at the college, when you went there, they let you take courses for free. So there I was, what am I gonna do? I'll take a couple of psychology courses. It was free. And then I found out that if you're registered for 6 credits, you can borrow $5,000 a year. And I needed that money to do my house. So that's what I did. I kept taking courses and borrowing money. With that, I ended up, I don't know how, buying a house for, to rent out. It was $5,000 down payment and $5,000 for closing costs. And by the time I finished, I had a degree in psychology, and then I decided, you know what? I'll be a school psychologist, because that's teaching in school. So I went further, I became a school psychologist, which I really liked. That was my favorite job that I had. And from there, I decided to get a doctorate, because I'm still going to school. And so I did, I got my doctorate. But the reason that forced me to do it, I was working at Coldenham Elementary School, November 16th, 1989, when a cafeteria wall fell and 13 children died. And I was working there as the psychologist. And it was unbelievable. The superintendent's walking around saying, we lost another one. We lost another one. Parents are coming up. It was on the police speakers. The cops put up a center in my office. They were wonderful. A command center. And I'm saying, why the hell did God put me here? There's gotta be a reason. And so to make meaning of it for myself, I did my dissertation on the effect of trauma on achievement, which is what was the effect the kids' scores before the year before it, the year of it, and then the third year after, to see how they had changed. And the scores did start to recover after the third year. But the most wonderful thing about that was it became socially acceptable to go to therapy, which in that community was not the way they usually thought. And so people who were alcoholics, people who were abused, people who were this, would come in the neck, why are you here? Well, Coldenham, And so it really changed the mentality of that. And I'm gonna have to end now, but that job got me a job at the military. And I was doing that for 10 years, going from base to base all over Europe. So that's how I was doing. Just
Thank you, borrowing money and going to school.
Right.
Thank you, Bonnie. Bonnie has some wonderful photographs of Turkey out, of course, from the dining room. If you haven't seen them, go and see them. Those are the Kurds. Kurdish people are not, they're not welcomed, and they're hated in Turkey because they're separatists. They don't send their kids to school, they don't do this, they don't speak their, so that's the life.
It's a very interesting exhibit. Well, I think that you've gotten to me. I started off as an elementary school teacher, which I did not want to be. My father was very insistent that his paying for my education went hand in hand with my becoming a teacher. And the reason that I gave in to him was I was in college when I was 16 years old. And when I said, I'm not gonna go to college, my father said to me, what are you gonna do, sell ribbons in Woolworth? Which sounds very funny so many years later, but it wasn't that funny when he said it to me then. So I did go to college, and at 20 I graduated and I became an elementary school teacher. And I did that for a couple of years, and I kept saying, I don't like this. I like the kids, but I don't like being in a classroom all day. I don't like being told what to do by the Board of Education. I don't like having the principal walk in whenever they felt like they wanted to walk in. So at that time, I was getting married, and I stayed as a teacher for a couple more years, and then I had a child. And so I took some time off, and I went back to school, and I got a degree in counseling psychology. I always wanted to run my own program, because those of you who know me know that I'm pretty stubborn, and I have my own ideas about how to do things, and I wanted to have that opportunity. And as luck would have it, New York State was giving out a grant in child welfare, and there were 5 counties that they were giving the award to. So happens that Dutchess was one of the counties that got the grant, and Staten Island, where I was working, got the grant also. And I went for an interview, and I got the job. And so I got into child welfare, where I remained for the next 17 years. Not at the same job. I worked for a mental health society. I ended up working for the city of New York. I was a director of the Brooklyn field office, which is the largest field office in the world. And I supervised something like 150 people, and we had thousands of cases. I learned, I can't even begin to tell you how much I learned during those 17 years about people, about how people live, about ideas that I had about race, about income, things that I never challenged within myself. I found that I had to examine. I worked for the commissioner on cases where we did autopsies, I mean paper autopsies, not physical autopsies, when a child died who was in our care. And we also had preventive programs for people who got into difficulty with the courts because it was felt that their children were neglected in some way. And we had choices to make about removing children from their parents, which was very difficult. Sometimes we had to go, I didn't do that, I wasn't doing field work, but my workers sometimes had to go in with the police in order to remove a child. And it was very intensive kind of work. People have asked me, how did you do that? How did you do that for so many years? And when I look back on it, I'm not sure I could say that this is how I was able to do it, but at the time, I was very committed to it. I don't know if I would choose it again, but it just happened, and I worked with some very, very committed people who really feel that children are not treated well, and they're not. There are hardly any good mental health services for children. There are almost no mental health hospitals for children to be given the kind of services that they need. But anyway, after 17 years, I retired from that particular job, and I went to work for one of the commissioners that was working for HRA, which is the Human Resources Administration for New York City, and they administer welfare programs, adult protective services, domestic violence. I worked for all the good things, you know, the drug addicts, the wife beaters, and I found out a lot about how this world works and how it doesn't work. And finally in 2000, I retired after developing some programs, and I feel like I had a very interesting career, met a lot of different people, learned a lot, and grew a lot within myself during that time, and it sort of evolved. It wasn't anything that I planned, it wasn't anything that I set out to do, it just sort of happened. And it happened in a good way for me. So we have heard from everybody. She talked about you talked about your job.
Yes.
Yes. You've heard from everybody here. And I'm going to open this up to anybody who has any questions or makes any comments or anything. Anybody? My God. Nobody has any comments?
Pat, do I need a mic? Oh, thank you so much.
I just want to say thank you. Thank you not only for all that you've done for so many throughout your careers, but thank you for what you're doing for those of us who live here and are your friends and neighbors. And I mean this sincerely. Going as recent as Rhea running this program offering for anybody who is looking for some support. And thanks to Tamar, who's running the COVID conversation group, because of all the people here who have suffered together and isolated and lonely. And to those of you who are fairly new to us, whom we have not seen much of because of the separation due to COVID, just a thanks. Thanks for being good neighbors and friends.
I was just gonna say thank you, and I appreciate your sharing your stories. It's wonderful.
Oh, thank you. So glad to be able to do this. It's really a very,
Is this one working? Yes, look at that. It's really been a pleasure to do that, and it's been a pleasure when we met and we were able to find out more about each other and work through to get to this program. And it reminded me that I always believe we should do more of these kind of things in Woodland Pond. There are all kinds of things to explore, and people have had all kinds of experiences in their background, and the more we can share with each other, the better off we are. So I thank you all for coming.
I just want to say, as I sit here and look out at the faces, I know many of you, I know what you've done in your lives, and everybody is just amazing. This was planned for women in mental health, but as I look out, so many women who have done so many interesting things, and I just wish we could have more programs and sort of in other fields or, mixed fields, whatever, but I look at you and I just see a room of gems.
We just have to do it, What happens is that people are shy, they don't feel like their background is important enough, so they don't volunteer, and that's why things don't happen. But I'm gonna just read to you about the next, part 2 of this series is providing healing and hope in the nursing and medical profession, presented by Michelle Cacavano, Flo Jordan, Frida, I think that is, Feldman, June Feiner, and Joan Mandy, and that will be next Tuesday, March 22nd at 7 o'clock, same place.
no men. No men.
No men?
No men.
This is Women's History.
We'll be here.
That's right, this is Women's History Month, Lola. Anybody else? Not?
Well, yes, I wanted to add that I didn't say before, that one of the tasks of working in public school is to work with parents, especially I was working with Hispanic parents, not because I have something against other parents, but we could share the language. And a lot of parents, especially minority parents or poor, they don't know all the holes that you have in the system, and they don't know how to use the system. And one of our tasks of all of us is to help those parents to get the best for that they can be offered for the children, and they don't take advantage of this.